and that we're taking moral responsibility for the whole culture that allowed the production of these forms of brutality, that we need to take moral responsibility. Where have we gone wrong as a culture to produce this level of ugliness? I was so always struck and touched when I read his posts or his letters or some of parts of his speeches, or listened to some of his stuff on YouTube, at the level of moral responsibility, of how he always stressed the idea of that we are all responsible for what's taking place, and his willingness to bridge that gap with these forms of ugliness. So he became number one wanted in the area around Damascus. Why? Because he was one of the main organizers of the Rose Initiative, where they gave bottles of water attached to a rose with letters, telling them, in one of the letters that Riyadh Matar, this young activist and friend of Yahya Sharbaji, I saw some of the drafts of where he was trying to write the letters where they say, we are brothers and sisters, this our homeland fits all, let us demonstrate peacefully. These sort of messages that we belong to one country, and were delivered to these security personnel. And in many ways, the death rates of Daraya were lower than other areas. Although other areas were committed to nonviolence, but the Daraya group was really trying to also reach out. The Daraya group in the last few months lost 12 people. 12 people were shot, and they have about close to 1,000 detainees at the moment. And it's only 300,000 people in this suburb. It's very close. It's a town close to Damascus. And so they were very much on the hunt for Yahya Sharbaji and Riyadh Matar, because they were, and the message and the Daraya demonstrations were becoming increasingly gentle and peaceful, and people weren't even uttering aggressive slogans, and the ideas were fairly spreading, and people were really realizing the power of this engaged, committed nonviolence. And because of that, Yahya was becoming increasingly a dangerous man. And so they were on the run, they were in hiding. And I always tried to think that they were safe for some reason, and because it week in, week out, they were okay. I was trying to always think, although in the back of my mind I would be worried. So one day the regime security air forces set an ambush for the group. They caught Yahya's brother. They forced him to make a phone call telling the group, members of the group, that he was shot in the leg. And they rushed to him and they caught them. They caught Yahya, Riyadh, and Yahya's brother. And because they felt that they caught a worthy captive, they paraded the three young men around the city for about 3 or 4 times, showing the people off, which is such, a medieval practice. And I was told that their heads were high and they had their usual gentle smiles. That was September 6th. And I was with the group in communication with them minutes before they left. And I stayed with another friend who was very worried. And I'm on Skype, typing and sometimes talking. And I'm worried, but at the same time, I'm also away from that context. So I'm trying to understand the level of danger. And he's very much worried about Riyadh. And he's telling me Riyadh is a young guy and he's less known than Yahya. I'm really worried about Riyadh. And I'm thinking, this is a radically nonviolent group. It's one of the gentlest faces of the revolution. They've become fairly well known. And in some ways, I thought they're out of danger's way, because I was always afraid of the snipers during demonstrations, that they would be shot at. And in fact, Riyadh used to tell his friends that if I get shot at, keep the war, keep going on. And so I kind of thought, okay, they might mistreat them, but they're in prison. September 10th, I wake up Saturday morning, local time in Montreal, and I open my email to find an email that was one of those very, very, very painful moments of my life. Riyadh's body was delivered back to his family with signs of severe torture. and they released a video. And it takes me a couple of hours before I can sit and see the video, just from the description of what took place in those 3 days. That I read that there are burns of signs of extreme burns on his body, bullet shots, strangling signs on his neck. His neck is very blue, and when I watch the video, because my friend, who has been actually joking with me, Riyadh himself, a day before his arrest in a virtual demonstration on Facebook about protecting me, because they rarely appeared on Facebook, and when sometimes they appeared, we would be very happy that they showed up, and because we knew they were doing activism on the ground, and they don't always have access to internet, and they weren't using the internet that much, except, you know, I mean, for their work and communicating. And so then at some point in the virtual demonstration, Riyadh says, "You have a Canadian citizenship, Afra, maybe we can use you as a human shield." And I say, gladly so. I'm nervous because, you know, it's something that they live, and it's for me very virtual and imaginative. And they're joking about, "Yahya, take care, the snipers have appeared on the buildings." Yes, go to the other side. And, you know, all that conversation is taking place, and many friends notice what's going on. They join in, and Yahya teases me. He says, "Afra, I can't believe you arrived at the protest in high heels." And I say, "Don't worry, I have running shoes in my bag." And then Riyadh says, "Hey guys, Afra has Canadian citizenship. Why don't we use that? Maybe she can be a human shield." And I say, "Gladly so." And Riyadh says, "But you have to hold the sign. Say, I'm a Canadian citizen." And I say, "I'll do that, and I'll go to the very front." And then, and I say, and maybe I should scream that, because Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt were visiting 2 years ago with the president. And I say, maybe I should shout, "They're behind me." And they all kind of put smiley faces. And then Riyadh, and it's one of the last posts, he says, "Afra, I changed my mind. No, we need to protect you because our bullets chase women." And that was his last line to me. And so when I hear the news of this, the first thing that keeps coming out of my mind and my mouth to my husband is that he wanted to protect me in a virtual demonstration, and I couldn't do anything to protect him. I couldn't do anything to protect him. And that is an overwhelming thought when you know in a split of second that you are caught up in a moment where you can't reverse time, and that there's something that has been forever sealed, and that there's no undoing of that pain. And yet because of, you know, I got to know his humor and his positive attitude, I kind of also get a feeling that he's saying, but you can protect the movement, you can protect other things, because he had that always positive attitude about him. And then I sit to see the video, and I feel, and it's very hard for me to see some of the videos that are coming out of Syria, but I feel if he has gone through this pain for 3 days, at least I can do this for him as a tribute for 2 minutes. And I'm terrified, of course. And yet, seeing his beautiful face, although darkened in some areas from the beatings, and that gentle hint of a smile that he used to have, despite the brutal signs of torture, gives me a sense of peacefulness and centeredness, and his peace exudes from that beautiful body of his. He was a bodybuilder, and he had won some medals in the Damascus area, and a tall guy, and young, and with that gentle smile, and I really felt that I was watching something mythic unfolding in that moment. That, you know, a Greek god being handled back to his family, but on the other hand, the thing that kept coming to my mind when I saw these signs of incredible torture that kept echoing in my mind, it was the Jesus of Daraya, the Jesus of Daraya. And for the first time, I think it was the closest I came to the idea of atonement. When somebody goes through that much pain, giving and dying for having given roses and wanting to awaken love in the other side. And I feel that is what Jesus was about love being nailed and yet completely fulfilled in love, and never giving that up, that space of love, even in such moments of pain. And then of course I see a long incision on his body, which has been a repeated pattern in the bodies delivered back to families, all the way from his chest, all the way below his abdomen, and badly stitched back together, indicating what we've been hearing, possible organ theft. And he was 24, 25. They say he's 26, but actually he's less than 26, a young body. And I called his mother, who happens to be the cousin of a friend of mine. 2 days later, I couldn't do it initially, and then at some point I was going to do an interview, and my sister said, you will do the interview better if you talk to his mom. And I had to use all my centeredness to call her. And there were moments when we both choked up, and I could sometimes hear the tears in her words, but there was so much determination and courage and power and compassion. And she said the best tribute for my son Afra, she said, is that his ideas and his story is spread around, and that his name is never forgotten. And I thought in the midst of all that pain and suffering, there was so much light in what she was saying. And I promised her, I said, I will do all the best, because your son has become the face of what's taking place in Syria. And the story has reached CNN. We have many friends who worked on getting the story out. And the American ambassador, along with German, Japanese ambassadors, went to the wake to visit his family. And the family was prevented actually from holding a wake. And 3,000 soldiers, or close to that, hundreds of security forces surrounded the area for the funeral. They prevented them from having a public funeral. And from what I'm hearing, that the grave is still under regime surveillance, preventing people from visiting the grave site. And of course, in the midst of all this, we are extremely concerned for the safety of Yahya. But the reason I'm telling you in detail the story is because we tend not to connect to abstract numbers. We are wired to relate to personal stories. And these are some of the local stories. There are many more like them. There's a young woman who was cut up and delivered back to her family just a few days after Yahya's story in another city. A famous, internationally renowned cartoonist was beaten up almost to death, his fingers broken because he's a cartoonist, he does political cartoons, and his wrist completely, the ligaments torn, thrown for half dead on the highway to the airport. One of the celebrities of Syrian public life. A psychoanalyst disappeared a week ago in her 60s, a famous psychoanalyst in 64, Rafah Nasheed. The girl who was cut up and delivered back was taken also as a hostage to ask for her brother. When they shoot the brother, they deliver back the body, but with a decapitated head and cut off hands in together, the pieces. But they're doing these brutal acts everywhere, and attacking celebrities and arresting some even public figures to show that they will stop short of nothing, that nothing is sacred anymore. I think the regime is trying to tell. And you probably heard the story of the also 13-year-old child who was tortured and mutilated and given back to his family. So it's because the wall of fear has broken down, and the regime is trying to rebuild that wall, because it does not get its legitimacy from the people. So it's trying to create these acts, random acts of terror, including the beating also of the parents, brutal beating of the parents of a famous Syrian pianist who lives in Boston, because he's been out speaking about what's going on in place, and he's one of those outspoken people, an amazing artist. And so the idea is that fear is what's protecting this regime, and people have lost their fear. And I'm trying to get the message across, and as many of my friends are also trying to do in different parts of the world, that the Syrian struggle is a global struggle, is a humanitarian struggle. It's also one of those friction points between the models of fascism and brutality and the extreme ends of the model of military and violent dominance in the face of a population that has decided to step out of that, which means what they're doing is a message to all of us that this struggle is not just a Syrian struggle, but it is a humanitarian struggle. It's a global struggle. It touches everyone on the planet. I remember when Terry McLuhan was here and she presented, some of you probably have seen her documentary on Abdul Ghaffar Khan, and I was telling her how he was extremely a symbolic figure and a significant hero for the Muslim community to reclaim their nonviolent heritage, especially as recent and modern as Abdul Ghaffar Khan, who worked with Gandhi and not just from medieval or ancient times. And she said something that stayed with me. And she said, yes, Afra, he was Muslim, but he belongs to all of us. And on that note, I want to end that. Riyadh was Syrian, and yes, he was close friends with personal friends of my friends, and I became friends with his over the last few months, and I got to like very much. But Riyadh doesn't belong to Syria, nor to me, nor to his family. Riyadh belongs to all of you, to all of us, because he represents that face of compassion, a youth holding a rose in the face of a brutal killing machine. Thank you.
In the prisons, and I see some parallels, you know, people with the power over people without power, and there's similarities, and of course anyone here is brutal, but there. And one of the things of this act of nonviolence is that ability and to know the humanity of the people on the other side. And I haven't heard, and I'm hearing the torture, I'm hearing the evilness, but where is the beauty on the other, the humanity on the other side? I hear the power, but I'm just wondering what other face they've got.
That's a very good question, and that's what really Yahya was working on, and that's why I mentioned that the death rate in Daraya has been less than other areas, and that's what I've been in touch a couple of days ago with the group, with some of the organizers who are in hiding and on the run, and they said one of the challenges for the Daraya group is to make other Syrians understand that yes, there is brutality everywhere, but they're trying to say there's another area that has, for example, 200,000 people, and the death rate has been over 50 in the last few months. 50 people were shot at, and almost the same number of detainees. Daraya has 12 shot. So they're telling them 50 and 12, that's a lot, there's a gap. And so they're trying to use these numbers to show that we were able to reach some humanity in the other side, even though there's still brutality. But the fact that the death rate is lower, there must be something that happened. And there has been many stories, actually, that I'm glad you asked this question, that really, really make me feel that perhaps some of the most important heroes in this struggle is the soldiers who refuse to shoot and refuse to do this and who are shot and tortured themselves. And this has been also a pattern. And of course, those who are shot at, the regime tries to claim that because there are armed groups and they're shooting at them, but many of them are shot from behind by their superiors. And so I'm hoping that just as we will celebrate, I'm hoping in the post-regime Syria, people are really, really being touched by these stories of defection and resistance and willing to die and being tortured by the regime, refusing to shoot at their own people. So there are these amazing moments of defiance that are happening. And so it's kind of, you get caught up in a certain grip, and it doesn't mean that the humanity of the other side is lost, but there's a momentum that is happening. And that's what Yahya was trying to understand, that these people we are facing are victims themselves. And that he was trying to get that message across to the people he was working with, and he was successful at that. And I think that's why the regime is afraid of people who are reconnecting the elements of the society together and creating these bridges. And for many of us, that is the challenge, is to get also not at what they're doing, the brutality, but also at the cause of that. What are they so afraid of to commit these ugly acts? And also, what is the level of self-hate that goes with that, to commit that sort of ugliness? And the more people also commit these acts of ugliness, the more there is self-hate, and then it becomes a vicious cycle. So that's why the nonviolence movement is saying that it's, instead of looking at individuals, we need to look at this cycle of violence and to break it, regardless of, you know, of the individuals themselves. Because even if the regime is replaced and another entity comes into power, if the cycle of violence has not been broken, then nothing has changed. That evil is still being committed, but on the hands of other people. So then where do we start? So that's why I think it's extremely, like what you're asking about is extremely important, and it's at the core of what the Daraya group is trying to achieve.
Why don't you give some background on the Alawite community's historical experience, and also, you know, the question of where do they have to go in the society if they give up power?
Yeah, the regime belongs to a small sect in Syria, a religious sect that kind of was an offshoot from certain groups in the Muslim heritage and history, and they've survived for hundreds of years in Syria. But they also belong to rural areas, and there were class differences, and in some ways they were oppressed and exploited economically. So one of their means for upper mobility was the army, like many minorities.
Sure.
And so when President Hafez al-Assad came to power, and he belongs to this small sect, he relied, of course, on many other minorities and on many other groups in Syria. And he did not serve his community, by the way. There are still a lot of poverty in some Alawite villages in the mountains on the coast in Syria. But he also involved in many ways, especially the security forces, his community. And so in some ways, their destiny has become somewhat tied to the regime, although not completely exclusively so, because there are other groups that are involved with the regime. It's not completely a sectarian rule. And there are many people who are complicit with the regime, especially from the Sunni predominant population. However, they are in a peculiar position, and they are increasingly getting scared. Some of their leaders came out and said, we need to separate our destiny from that of the regime because they're drowning us and they're dragging us down in history. But on the other hand, I also feel their fear, because after 40 years of being connected to this brutal regime, it's a community that stands to lose a lot, and that stands to be afraid. However, the rest of the Syrians are telling them, if we have been able to restrain ourselves under these levels of violence, why are you afraid of us? So then they say that, but we haven't seen you get back into power. We don't know what you will do. And so you could, I mean, this,
would you
I'm
compare that to
simplifying.
like the Afrikaners in South Africa?
It's many ways. So many people keep thinking of that. And so it's a difficult situation. And I think that's why there are acts of violence that are quite ugly, because when you see, it's not just repression, but there's some sort of ugliness that, to me, is indicative of a profound fear. And fear and victimology creates violence. Victims are dangerous. Victims are violent. And so there's almost a projected victimhood that's going on, and that's why there's this brutality that's coming from a visceral, deep fear, given also the history of the last 40 years. And the losses of civilian lives among Syrians and the brutal prison systems and torture. Because always, you know, in the last few decades, the Arab and Muslim world have been completely dwarfed and caricaturized as a violent terrorist culture, and the West that is throwing bombs and even having used 2 nuclear bombs on 2 big civilian populations as the carrier of peace and freedom of democracy. So I think it is a moment for all of us to reflect, and I think this is one of the difficulties the West is having difficulty dealing with these uprisings, is because most of them are nonviolent, and I think that's why the Libya story was more prominent in Western media, because it has blood and it has bombs and it's a sexier story. I'm sorry to use that term, as one of a Canadian journalist told me. He said, I'm sorry to use this term. He said, but the Syria story is not a sexy story. And I kind of thought, he said, I'm sorry, but that's how the journalists are talking about it. There's suffering, there's death, there are people who are trying to do something. But he said, Libya, I mean, you know, it has all the drama. It has bombs, it has blood, and it has a lunatic on the run. Like, you know, now we have a new Bin Laden or Saddam on the run. I mean, you know, that's a drama to keep feeding kind of, you know, the usual media sensationalist hunger that, hey, we have like another, you know, we finished Saddam, we finished Bin Laden, now there's another lunatic, now we need to fight. And that's why I'm hoping that kind of paradigm would shift, and to see actually the beauty and the drama in the other context, and the incredible symbolism and heroic acts and sacrifices that these people, and especially many of them are outstanding individuals, but also in many ways, as the Daraya group said, but Afra, also average individuals. Yes. Like you're average, and if you see the pictures of Riyadh and his friends, you would feel that there are some of the kids and young people you would encounter here on the streets in St. Paul, in many ways. And if you sit with them, I mean, they are that kind of people too. But they are caught up in a historic struggle and in a fateful moment. We use violence, then the casualties would be more, and that we would be moving to the battlefield of the dictatorship whose power lies in force, whereas our power lies in our moral struggle, and that is their weak point, that's our strong point. I mean, they're all that kind of tactical thinking and planning and really trying to use a certain logic why nonviolence is the only means to achieve victory. There's that going on, but then there is also that the spiritually and morally inspired and historically inspired elements, like the Daraya group and like many groups in Hauran who are committed to nonviolence, as I've seen on a post from Hauran that said nonviolence is not just our tactic to win, but it is a lifestyle. And it comes from more a paradigm that is also spiritually inspired by Islamic values of compassion and nonviolence, and inspired by other historic models, where these groups see that there's a kind of a continuity around the world with this paradigm, with this proposition that has kept coming up everywhere, and now it's their turn to hold the torch. That's, some groups see it this way. But in general, there's a general commitment to nonviolence. However, that I've been telling people, we have to be realistic. I don't want to idealize the movement. There has been some mistakes also committed. When you have, as Jean Sharp points out, when you have a large-scale revolution, there would be mistakes. And I think it's responsible and accurate to acknowledge some of these mistakes. There were some security thugs shooting at the people who were thrown off buildings in some cities. That happened. And also, I've heard that in one of the major cities, that where people have become desperate, they decided to use some violence in order to protect the nonviolence of the revolution. So what they did, because there are some personnel from the army that defected, and some soldiers and officers, they said we want to protect the civilian population. So they started sending, and you know what, I'm pretty sure there are probably some civilians helping them. I mean, to be realistic, unless we have some investigation, I feel like we need to be responsible in the way we're imagining the situation. And yet I'm shocked at the level also of idealism and commitment. So in that city, there was an attempt to create some sort of protection. So those soldiers who defected, they started sending news to the shabiha, to the thugs, and the security forces that we will demonstrate, but if you start shooting, we will shoot back at you to protect the protesters, and that if you enter homes to rape or kill, we will kill you. That sort of thing, because they wanted to create a sense of that Syrian life was not that cheap, because they get paid $10 to $20 per day. On Fridays, it's a little more to go out and kill. And when you have a killing machine that uses a sniper and shoots at the people, I mean, it seems they have also rules about not causing more than 20 per demonstration or something casualties. It seems there has been some leaked information, and we are seeing that pattern, 20 here, 15 here, sometimes 50 here, and so it seems they're trying to control a certain number to control it, but not cause a major slaughter that would maybe, you know, get the whole country out or shock the international community. So and that's why the death rate at the moment, after 6 months, official numbers, recorded names, is 3,200. I think it's a little more than that even at the moment. That was last week's numbers. But the people on the ground are putting it at 8,000, because and that's not counting the close to 20,000 forced disappearances. So that's why some areas that are not as ideologically committed to nonviolence, but they are committed to it as a political means, have been experimenting with that to the shock of people like Daraya, and saying, no, you can't do it like that. And I try to be open-minded, although my own ideological commitment is to the Daraya group, but we need to be morally responsible and report such incidents, and to also be accountable to these mistakes. And many people have been also issuing condemnations of these acts. But on the other hand, there are people who started saying we need military intervention because we're being slaughtered here. And that how many people are we willing to sacrifice in order, and they feel they can't back off, because if they back off, the regime will liquidate the opposition and those people like systematically, because that's what the father did. And it's already happening. It's not that, oh, it will happen. They're already trying to target the leadership. So you see, I mean, that's why I feel like the more there's international attention, the more empowered the nonviolence movement will feel, and also the more convinced the other sides that are using it as a tactic and not just as a moral alternative. They will say, hey, look, you know what, they are getting attention, the more nonviolent side of the revolution. Maybe what they're doing, maybe we need to commit even more. And instead of becoming a survival game, it should become a moral cause. And the more the international community comes in to support the more radically or more morally committed elements in the nonviolence movement, the more empowered they will become in spreading their message. And although despite the silence, I feel they've been fairly successful too in reaching out to many groups in Syria. Well, the Syrians love American culture. And they love many of your figures and struggles and organizations and celebrities, but they really mistrust your foreign policy. And when the files were recently leaked that the United States are extraditing people to Gaddafi to proxy, you know, torture by proxy, which they've also done with Syria through Guantanamo and all that.
Right.
And the cooperation between the intelligence of Syrians and American intelligence, then the Syrians like, duh, that's why we don't want military intervention, because we don't want to put ourselves at the risk of a foreign power whose interest we're not so sure about. And that's why they're so committed to not wanting a military intervention. Plus, of course, because the dominant paradigm of the revolution is also a nonviolent one. And so, however, this is what I keep getting from youth movements and what I see in writings, is that they want intervention, but moral intervention from not just one entity, but from all over the world. where Syria is really, really pressured to allow foreign media and international observers, and the Security Council forcing Syria to put international neutral bodies of international human rights investigators and observation units that stay with the people, and possibly that opening the chance for human shields, maybe, as Riyadh was imagining in his playful demonstration, and getting some public figures to support the Syrian revolution, because they feel we need to use so many alternatives before we even think about that. Why don't we come up with ideas that would create alternative forms of intervention that are still in line with the values of the revolution, the peaceful values, and while also keeping the sovereignty and independence of the Syrians. So this is very much what they want, because if you have anything like Tahrir Square in Syria, which the Syrians attempted, by the way, many years to start congregating in some of the plazas in Damascus and other cities, you will have a complete shift of the events. And the regime is so keen on not letting that happen at all. I mean, a lot of the attempts of these demonstrations is like where they congregate and they start trying to go to open large areas, and where they would sit and not leave, even if there are some snipers. But they're not allowing that, including, they're using everything, including the use of tanks and brutal killings. And so if there's media in Syria, foreign media, I think things would shift. And I think Western powers are capable, I think, of exercising that pressure. But they're also not sure about what would happen if Assad goes. I mean, here is a regime that Nasrallah of Hezbollah wants, that Hamas wants, and Israel wants. I mean, these are traditional enemies, yet there's a certain status quo, a certain level of crisis management that they're all used, where a lot of the interests are preserved, where people are also legitimized in arming themselves, that would lose that kind of, the dance steps would be lost to many parties around Syria. And that's why Thomas Friedman, I think, said many of these countries are imploding, but when Syria loses, when the regime falls, it will explode, because it will not just change Syria, it will not just change the region, but possibly the world. So that's what there's so much at stake in the Syrian situation, because you have so many players. You have Turkey, Iran, the Gulf states, Israel, Hamas, Nasrallah, the Palestinian struggle. So one of my sisters was saying that, of course, there's so much at stake here, because all the armed gangs, whether big entities or small, are losing ground. Because you have a paradigm that goes against the grain of all that. And a lot of them, whether legitimate or illegitimate, are armed gangs. It's just as simple as that. Kathy, so.
Well, I'm really struck with what you talked about, the collective responsibility of a community, of a society for what the country does. How could this much brutality be surfacing in Syria? But in this country, our foreign policy, it's easy to stand back and be critical, and this community saying, we're not like that, it's our government's bad, it's oil, it's big money, it's Wall Street, it's whoever. But I think it's a higher level of development to say, we are complicit in some way in allowing this to develop, and how do we send roses and love letters in a way that softens the negative vote probably in the Security Council against the Palestinian state, and all the other foreign policy things that don't represent me.
And I think we have to get to the core of that fear, because people, the reason they use brutal force or all these strategies of isolation and animosity and all these kind of disconnecting discourses where our humanity is disconnected, where it's them versus us, Americans, and the world is our enemy. I think we need to start getting to bridge that gap and say that actually in the long run, even not so long run, that vibrant democracies helps you as a society and as a government, because you will have
less to fear, and there would be more security, and it would be more of a win-win situation than when you have areas that are, you may call stable, but they are pressure cooks. And that stable has become a euphemism for actually severe repression and volatile, explosive
Inside.
situations. You're dealing, you're banking on dictators who are brutally suppressing their people, and in the meantime, that it becomes a breeding ground for forms of extremism and all that, I mean, in the past few decades. But the amazing thing that the Arab public themselves have completely lost faith in even these extremist ideologies, and they never actually, it never took root. I know the United States, you always get the feeling that it's something that was mainstream, but I mean, that kind of like fanatic thinking was never part of the major culture. But there's anger and resentment, yes, but the way some people articulated that and their means was very much against the grain of the culture, which, I mean, the Middle East in many ways for centuries have had so many multiple ethnicities and religious coexistence, and I think that's why Middle Eastern people feel a bit frustrated when the West is trying to preach to us coexistence when they actually have left almost no religious and ethnic minorities amongst themselves, and they eradicated many communities. And in Europe, I mean, even the last pockets of Islam in Kosovo and Bosnia were almost recently eradicated, and Spain and Andalusia was pretty much, I mean, the age of the Inquisition, whereas in Syria, Damascus, which was at some point the capital of the Islamic Empire, you have towns close to Damascus that still speak Aramaic. I have friends, Syrian friends, who speak Aramaic, the original language of Jesus. Christianity survived in them, survived Islam. And so it's interesting when there's this kind of discourse that, oh, you know, Muslims are intolerant. Since when? Since when? I mean, if we have become somewhat intolerant, it's because of brutal colonial practices and brutal dictatorships that bred some, as Edward Said used to say, when you look at the larger picture, actually there's so much self-restraint and very little anger compared to what's taking place and compared to what's at stake. So I think we need to find bridges everywhere, like Yahya is doing with the Syrian regime. I think it's even easier for the American public to create these bridges with the American regime and to try to say, you are representing us, but these are not our values, and these emerging movements are closer in American values, and we need to be supportive because these people are watching what you're doing, and that your silence and complicity will further fuel the resentment of these people, or would create a lot of mistrust, and the faster we help, the greater pressure we place on these brutal regimes, the easier we will build the bridges, and the safer the world will become for all of us. Right?
I've been told that our only real political pressure point would be through Turkey. I mean, this country. What would that look like? How can we pressure the regime through Turkey? Does that make any sense?
Well, because geographically and economically, Turkey has strong connections to the regime. But I think it will require more of a collective international effort. You can't rely on just one country to create a pressure, especially with a regime that has been generally isolated in the world, that's used to that. And also a regime that does not get its legitimacy from its people nor from the international community. So why would it be pressured, really? Unless there's something that becomes for them a breaking point, unbearable, like the level of isolation and the level of exposure. I think isolation in this case is not as strong as exposure. I think exposure, and this is why the Syrian public is wanting media and observers to go in and to tell the story to the rest of the world, the level of brutality and what's going on, and also their commitment to nonviolence, to really get the story out, because they feel that would be stronger than just isolation or sanctions, because they can handle sanctions. So there are attempts to also dry up the resources. In Canada, we're trying to pressure Soncor to withdraw from Syria. The European Union has, in October, it will go in effect at the end of October, where they will cut off oil export from Syria, because it's oil and gas industries are not part of the national budget in Syria. They directly go to the palace. So that would be a major source of income. So at some point they will have to pay from their own pockets. And many people joke about how these are money-hungry crooks, that they wouldn't want to pay from their own pocket money to fuel their own survival. So there's that economic pressure side. But I think it has to be a collaborated effort where then there would be a breaking point, where the Syrian people then are empowered in a way that their negotiating power has increased from within. I think if there's anything that could be done, that's what like the Syrians want, that they are supported morally and globally as a people. And they are afraid of military intervention because you do not know the consequences of that, and it could divide also the country further, because some people might see it as a foreign intervention and try to resist. And I mean, we should learn from the situation of Iraq. And the Syrian youth has been using an analogy that I used at the Foreign Affairs Department in Canada, and that they liked very much, because they kept saying also, we look at Iraq, we have learned so many lessons from Iraq, and we don't want to repeat these lessons. And I said the analogy that the Syrian youth movement has been using is that when people, especially like some of the silent people in Syria, keep saying that we don't want the Iraq scenario, we don't want the Libya scenario, we don't want, they're afraid. So they say, look at Iraq and look at Syria, and they say, when an egg is crushed from the outside, you have no chick. When the chick is ready, it breaks the egg. So the Syrian youth movement is seeing itself, and I love this analogy, and I think like what a good way of putting it, that they feel that you can't come and dictate a democracy over a nation that is already brutalized. But when a nation is ready and trying to throw off the shackles of dictatorship, it's the little chick that's breaking the shell. And that chick needs to be supported, at least morally, and through the media. So I feel that it captures really what's going on, that this is not an Iraq situation. This is a people who have decided to rise up against a dictatorship. So it's an internal, organic process.
How do you see that as, is that analogous to how you see the Iranians when they overthrew the Shah?
Yeah, that was organic. But unfortunately, the revolution, and this is what also the Syrians are very, very keen on, is that no side of the revolution takes over this revolution. And that's why the Egyptians are still very much at it, because they don't want anybody to become the spokesperson for the revolution, that they want to keep it democratic, pluralistic. And I think the Middle East has come a long way in the past few decades. They've learned, I mean, every time there's something, like everybody thinks the Iranian revolution. But also that's more than 30 years ago, and it's a different context. And people have seen what also religious dictatorship does. So the Syrians, even I've talked to some people who are very religious, they do not want a theocracy at all, because their ideas might be different from that particular group that would come into power, and that they might be persecuted. So they really want governments that are secular, that are neutral. The word secular, however, in Syria is a little bit sensitive because the Assad regime is secular. I know in the West, the word religious is a little scary because a lot of the religious wars and the oppressions happen in Western history because of religious institutions, and secularism was somewhat the savior in some ways. I mean, I'm simplifying here, but only. and whereas in the Middle East, we coexisted in these pluralistic communities throughout the ages until colonialism arrived, and then we had secular military dictatorships where a lot of us died under secularism and were oppressed. So the word secular has a slightly scary connotation. I have to explain this to some of my professors at the graduate studies department back in Montreal, and they got it. And I said, secular is scary for the Arab world to a large extent because it's experience. Religious, we have not had the religious wars and the religious kind of dictatorships. Yeah, maybe Iran is somewhat, and that's what made also the Egyptians and the Syrians really have a strong aversion to any form of dictatorship. They do not want a fascist secular dictatorship. They don't want a religious theocratic dictatorship. They want what they have now come up with an interesting term, a civic democracy. ديمقراطية مدنية. And so I find it fascinating that they don't want secular, they don't want theocratic. I have a friend who Gail and Erica met yesterday, who's a law professor who's working on a book called Not Secular, Not Theocratic, but Not Impossible.
Yes, and that was kind of my question too. It's very easy to be against something, and we see that over and over again, and Iran was a good example of that. It's easy to be united when you're against something. But what about the for? What about is there a consensus about what could happen afterwards? And I have to say, I heard a scary report, news report recently about the divisions within
Are there
the
other than
democracy.
scary reports about the Middle East?
Yeah.
I would be interested if you read something really comforting in a short exception. Scary people.
Yeah, no, I mean about the democracy movement in Syria not being real united about what comes next. I heard this report that there
I'm
were
part
divisions.
of that.
Okay.
The opposition now.
Yeah, and I'm just curious because it's so much easier to be against something than it is to be for something. So after the revolution happens, after Assad is gone, what's the vision? Where are things headed? Is there a consensus about that?
I think the West is far more afraid of what might come after Assad than us, because we just feel like we can get along. I mean, you know, we are meeting with, you know, like different, you know, the Islamists are sitting with radical atheist communists. I mean, you know, and both sides have been imprisoned and really paid hefty prices for the last 40 years. So I think there's a common struggle and a common suffering to these fractions in Syria, from the far left to the far right. And the majority of the Syrian people, I have to say, are in between. But moderate in the West is not necessarily what they see as moderate, because in the United States, moderate is Harsa Al, who writes infidel. In order to be moderate, you have to be a self-hating Arab and a self-hating Muslim. If I come out and I say, I've discovered that my culture is terrible and I'm so oppressed and persecuted and everything I believed in was false, then I would become a celebrity. Like,
Yeah, right.
but if I say, well, you know, we have some bad stuff that we need to work on, there's some good stuff that, you know, we can capitalize on in the culture, and that our culture is just like any other culture. It has had a long history of resistance, whether in the women's movement, whether in terms of progressive ideas. That is not a very sexy story. So in general, it is sad that what is considered moderate, many people meet me and they say, you're Muslim. And I haven't opened my mouth, but they say, but you must be moderate. Not really. I'm radical. I believe in radical nonviolence, and some of my feminist views are considered actually slightly fanatic. And so, but I mean, it's fairly interesting to see who are presented as moderate, and so it's a situation where, because it's a culture under siege, so we need some the Uncle Tom kind of version that makes the West feel really good about its like universal values, and that look, we accept Muslims, but without really paying attention to what sorts of Muslims that are acceptable to Western radar. So in general, like the Egyptian society, I know people were really alarmed when they saw the Friday prayers, but I mean North America has a long history of church activism and progressive church activism, and the Martin Luther King movement was so much spiritually inspired, but they don't allow that to Muslims, that you have to turn your back to your tradition and culture, and how dare you even take any source of empowerment and symbolism from your own families and background. You need to be completely cut off from your culture for us to accept you as a human civilization. And that is, I think,
Radical.
racist. And so what the Egyptian people are doing, and so people start to realize that no, these are praying, and it's a source of, and the Christians sometimes were surrounding them to protect them in Egypt, if you remember, and sometimes the Muslims were surrounding the Christian Egyptians when they were doing mass on Sunday, and sometimes Christians were so angry about the way that security thugs were treating the Muslims during Friday prayers that they would join and pray with them, which is also happening in Syria. Some Christians come to the mosques to pray with the people and to come out with them in demonstrations. And the West is like, they're praying Friday prayer? They're praying Friday prayer? Are they religious? Is this Iran? And it's so funny, this like kind of like almost a thermometer of like the level of religiosity, like measuring, okay, how, to what extent can we like tolerate this level of poison, like Islam, you know, like to what extent, you know, it should be allowed to be present. But it's part of the culture, and the Egyptian culture is not a fanatic culture, the Syrian culture is not a fanatic culture, but they do take a certain source of identity, and especially because you have practices like Ramadan and Friday prayers, and especially in countries where you've had dictatorships, these became only the almost organic forms of social networking. And so the American, the Syrian ambassador in the United States sits on CNN and he says, it's of course religious, and I have pictures of Zawahiri, he must, you know, he's the one responsible for the Syrian revolution. He says, they're coming out of the mosques. So, and I find that fascinating that I see my ambassador in the United States riding and capitalizing on Islamophobia to drive his agenda. It's like, yeah, my people are religious, you should kill them. Because we're killing the people you want actually to kill, because you don't negotiate with Muslims. You just shoot them and use cluster bombs. That's what we're doing. And he has files, and he says, of course I have pictures of people who are mobilizing this. And one of them is the Zawahiri, and the other is another religious figure, and 3 pictures. And literally the feeling I get is like as if I'm seeing somebody in a mental asylum who has cut up images from a magazine, and he says, like, this is my uncle, and you know, he shows you George Clooney. And he says, oh, and this is my daughter, Julia Roberts. And you can see he's using these generic names and putting Zawahiri, because he's, to the American, that's a buzzword, that's a buzz image. Oh, if Zawahiri is involved in Syria, and of course Zawahiri conveniently had just 10 days ago issued that, oh, the Syrians are engaged in a struggle against a dictatorship, whatever. Of course, they have a mic, they try to release statements. And the Syrians is like, please shut up. It's because we need to really, really, and I get inspired from my friend Yahya. Because every time we came upon obstacles, he would say, we need to find other creative, nonviolent means to put the regime on the reactive or the defensive mode, rather than us being on the defensive. We need to come up with creative ideas that would really put the regime in the reactionary place, instead of ourselves trying to always be on the defensive and reacting to the onslaught of the regime. So, and sometimes when I'm seeing people who really are using nonviolence as a tactic, rather than being influenced by Gene Sharp and some of the ideas of my uncle and other activists in the country, and then when the killing increases, there are these moments when they say, maybe we have exhausted the nonviolent option. And those who believe in the nonviolence option, the way they think is that, oh, maybe we have exhausted these means, wonder what other nonviolent means we have. But I think that's why some of us who are living in the diaspora, the Syrians who live in the diaspora, I think we have the responsibility to get the message across and to mobilize the international community. Because in some ways it is like South Africa. I mean, what made the South African model succeed was also not just the people on the inside, but there was this kind of rise of the international community and a global kind of awakening and awareness of what was taking place. And of course that took somewhat long, and I'm thinking, given the communication and the speed of communication, if there's some sort of really a global collaborative effort to really stand with the Syrian people and for the world to say, this is a nonviolent struggle, and then we start having some public figures who really support us, and even attempts to visit the country or do something, and I mean, there could be so many ways. I keep thinking of ways that like my friend said, human shields and international intervention in terms of media. I think the revolution can be aided to succeed as a healthy chick, to come out of it, and the shell to break down, instead of crushing the chick inside the eggshell. So that is the danger of relying on arms or international intervention. I think we have, as Syrians, and I'm trying to get the message across to other communities, that we have the moral obligation that this is a historic moment, and that if Syria succeeds non-violently, you have no many idea how many people are watching us, by the way, in the region. We have been contacted by the non-violence movement in Iran, and we're being contacted by some movements in Africa. They're watching us very closely, because they keep telling us, if you can overthrow Bashar non-violently, there is nobody in the world who cannot do it. So this will, that's why there's so much at stake, and that's why the Syrians really want to do it non-violently, because it will create a new phase in human political struggle and social justice. Because it's one of the most brutal regimes. That's why all of us who are interested in a non-violence movement, I think we really have a lot to lose if Syria doesn't win this struggle non-violently. There's so much at stake. So I think when I look at Syria, it's positioned geographically, it's multi-ethnic, multi-religious culture. It stands to be one of the leading figures in non-violence. And I personally have the hope, especially when I talk to my friends in the Daria movement or in the Hawran movement and among many other youth movements in Syria, that I think Syria would be one of the first Arab countries to disarm. I think we are ready for that, and many people believe in that. And before, a few years back, if you said that to the average Syrian, they would have said, oh, you know, we have so many enemies, yeah, it's nice, but it's ideal. A while back, I was talking about this among some average Syrians, and they looked at me, and I thought I would get the usual reaction. But because of the disgust with arms, the reaction was, why not? Let's be the Switzerland of the Middle East. And I thought, wow, like it just in a few months, the ideas of nonviolence have gained far more momentum, and people are more ready and willing to open up to even more radical ideas, like even completely disarming, which is fascinating. And I think the United States has to be aware of what is at stake in the Middle East at the moment. We are at a moment of a paradigm shift.
Yeah.